Now to business. Why do we interpret? I found myself asking this question in discussion after a conference in the Tavistock some months ago. And in the discussion, I found myself saying to somebody, but why do we interpret? And that question stayed with me ever since. Now, it so happened that last week, a patient who saw me 35 years ago wanted to check me out, having heard I'd had serious cancer, and came to see me. And he asked me, what are you doing now, and so on. And I was going to be talking in Brighton. What are you going to talk on? Why do you interpret? Ah, he said, no. Whatever you do, I want to make sure you draw their attention to the part of the word interpretation, inter. Now, it's not anything to do with the derivation, but he's playing with the word. Inter, between people. Insight is arrived at between people, as we used to do when I was seeing you. But I've been reading lots of analysis since then, and a lot of people don't seem to do that. They seem to do it to their patients. So he wanted me to make quite sure that I got this across to you. So that's his gift to you. Now, we have a daughter who's become a sort of Buddhist, and she's very fond of Dalai Lama. Why not? And I came across this lovely quote. In fact, she said to us, Dad, to me, you must take them seriously, she said. They teach compassion and do no harm to any living thing. And my ears pricked up as she was being a teenager from hell, and carried on like that for a long, long time. And I said, does that include parents? And she said she'd have to think about it. And she has thought about it, and no, she doesn't do any more harm to her parents now. Anyhow, there's a lovely quotation I came across this year from Dalai Lama. When you talk, you are only repeating what you know. But when you listen, you learn something new. Isn't that beautiful? When you talk, you are only repeating what you know. But when you listen, you learn something new. Now, I think we all need to face that there are many problems with training when we're training to be psychotherapists or psychoanalysts. There's all that bloody theory. And what we expect to do, and our supervisors expect us to interpret this and do it that way, and so on and so forth. And we've filled up with, as it were, directives from the theory, the teachers, the clinical seminars, the supervisors. Everybody seems to be telling us what to do. And when we are faced with our first patients, or even later, there's a strong incentive to try and demonstrate, at least to ourselves, that we have some degree of competence. That, you know, this person who's paying to see us get some evidence of what they're paying for. So we see opportunities to interpret. It's a bit like the I Spy books they used to have. I spy butterflies, I spy this, and you see a butterfly of a particular kind and you tick it off. And you see a clinical phenomenon which you've learned about. I've got something to say about that. It also happens, unfortunately, too often. It should never happen socially. But one of the besetting sins of people who've done trainings in psychotherapy is that they can't stop interpreting all over the place. They tend to interpret to their friends and their relatives and so on. And I read somewhere that it should be remembered that any interpretation given outside of a consulting room is an act of aggression. I think we need to remember that, because it's only in the consulting room that we have an invitation from this person for us to work with them in a certain way to try and understand what they are bringing to us. And in that context, and if we work together, we are not likely to do so much harm as if we try and do it on our own, trying to demonstrate competence. Now, I had to learn this the hard way, as most of us do. It so happened that my first, as I describe in my Learning from Life book, my first therapist seemed to be sold on the idea of reparenting. And she seemed to think that I had apparently suffered from lack of appreciation from family and others. I was seen all the time as a difficult child, which I was, and that's really all that anybody seemed to see. I went to her as a failed suicide, which I describe in Learning from Life, And she seemed to think that there must be better things for me to do with my life rather than taking it. Like what, I said. She eventually seduced me, literally seduced me into doing the BAP training. So I trained for her to please my therapist. And I felt so flattered that she saw potential in me and somebody seemed to be appreciating me and da-da-da. So I trained, but I didn't take any cases. I did 3 years of clinical stuff, theoretical stuff without going anywhere near a consulting room or a patient. And nobody could understand why. It was only later I realized why I had been so shy of seeing a patient, because I had not myself chosen to be a therapist. I did it to please her. And I later discovered that my therapy really had been a sort of false self-compliant therapy. It changed my life. I ended up being a therapist, which I would never have dreamt of being. And I don't regret that, because I then realized I needed to train more thoroughly than I had. So I had analysis to try and make good the deficit. Now, having no patients, but still working as a social worker, I was doing wild analysis all over the place. Here was a chance to observe bits of what I've been reading about and to show how clever I was. And I came across a clear example of melancholic defense. A colleague and I had been seeing, another social worker and I had been seeing a couple who had the most horrendous marriage. We saw them together and separately, alternate weeks. And when we saw them together, the wife was destroying this husband. She thought he was a waste of space, and which she'd never met him. He ruined everything, and there was nothing good she could say about him. And so it went on until suddenly he dropped dead. And then everything changed, and she paid for a huge, most expensive East End funeral. I may even have 2 black ponies and everything, you know, because this was the most wonderful husband who died. Now idealization had taken place of all the bad stuff that she saw in him before. Now, when I continued to see her, she developed an appalling skin rash, so severe that it covered her whole body, and she couldn't stop scratching, and she was scratching before my eyes and drawing blood from scratching. And I began to think of Freud saying, when a relationship breaks down and the ambivalence remains unresolved, what can happen is that the bad that used to be seen in the other is now invested in the self. And so the ego can take on the shadow of the object. And so she seemed to become the bad object with all the badness in herself, and she seemed to be punishing herself cruelly with all this scratching. And I thought, well, Freud talks about making the unconscious conscious, and this is going to make everything better. So I tried putting this to her, and she hated me instantly and refused to see me ever again. And I took this to a case discussion, and somebody said, well, no wonder she refused to see you again. All you managed to do is to add insight to injury, which I've never forgotten. I've never forgotten. So I think this is an appalling example, but only an example of what a lot of us can still do, where we go in heavy-booted with what we think is understanding to interpret something that we think we can observe. But why are we inflicting the patient with this so-called insight? What good does it do? Now, there's another caution that I like to quote, which I think every analyst and therapist should have printed out on their wall in their consulting room. Karl Popper, the philosopher, pointed out that that's a major problem with theory, because we tend to see only those things that appear to confirm our theory and to turn a blind eye to anything that may question it, which so easily happens in almost every consulting room, that we are seeing the things that the theory leads us to see, and we are not seeing the things that may question it. Now, I like to think, as part of my internal supervision, where I try to monitor myself in my work with patients. I don't still see patients now. I retired 10 or 12 years ago from seeing patients. I still supervise a bit. I like to think of the analytic space and to have a question always around who is putting what into this space and why. And so when we are giving an interpretation, whose mind are we giving expression to? We may think we are interpreting something in the mind of the patient, something we assume to be in the mind of the patient, and it's unconscious, you're not aware of it, but I've got the special insight to see what you can't see. And so I'm in this position of power to do this thing called interpreting assumed things about the other person's mind. But the only thing that you can be sure of is that I'm actually plonking onto the patient bits of my thinking. Whether or not it's actually going to tie up with their thinking, for sure it's ours. Possibly there may be some of theirs that it matches with. So I think we need to have that caution all the time in the work we do.